My son and his wife tried to make me sign away my entire life just weeks after my husband died. They moved into my home, took my mail, and answered my phone pretending to help me while they desperately tried to get their hands on my inheritance. They thought I was just a confused old woman who they could easily trick. They had no idea I was about to dismantle their entire world with one final word from my late husband. You know the sound of good crystal is supposed to be beautiful, a delicate ringing chime. But that night, sitting at my own dining room table, it set my teeth on edge. It was the sound of a life my husband Frank and I had built, a life of quiet substance, and it was being used as a prop in a play I never wanted to be in. Across the gleaming mahogany, my daughter-in-law Rebecca was the star of the show. Her laughter was just a little too loud, her smile a little too bright. She reached across the table and patted my hand, her nails perfectly manicured. She told me I'd been through so much that she and David just wanted to take care of everything now. But it didn't feel like a comfort. It felt like a claim. My son David sat right beside her, a ghost in his own childhood home. He just nodded along his face, a mask of strained agreement, his eyes looking everywhere but at me. It had been like that for 2 weeks, ever since the will reading. Those 2 weeks had been a blur of suffocating attention. Rebecca had insisted on this little family dinner, just the 3 of us in my Wellesley home. She'd called it a chance to strategize the future, but let me tell you, it felt more like a siege. She'd already arranged for a new cleaning service, telling me it was to take the burden off me. She'd had my mail rerouted to her house, saying it was just to handle bills while I grieve. She even started answering my landline with a chirpy proprietary, the Lane residence. Every move was wrapped in the language of kindness, but as a retired history teacher, I understand the nuances of a territorial dispute. I recognized the slow, methodical annexation of my life. The real move, the core betrayal, came after the lemon tart. Rebecca pulled a thick sheaf of papers from her leather portfolio and slid them across the polished wood. She said they were just some routine estate forms, something to help consolidate things and make managing the assets more efficient for everyone. She pointed to a line at the bottom of a page, her voice breezy, and told me if I could just sign there. My eyes are still sharp, thank God, and though the text was dense with legalese, 2 words leaped out at me: durable power of attorney. This wasn't a routine form, it was a surrender. It was the key to Frank's legacy, to the home we built together, to the security he had so carefully planned for me. I kept my voice calm and even. I told her I thought I'd like my lawyer to look at them first. Rebecca's smile tightened, and all the warmth vanished from her eyes in an instant. She insisted there was no need for that it was just family, that they were only trying to help. I folded my hands in my lap and told her I was sure they were, but that Frank always insisted I never sign anything without our lawyer Alan reviewing it first. I was using my husband's memory as a shield, and I saw the flash of fury in her eyes. The shield had held, for now. Later that night, the house settled into a resentful silence. I was on my way to the kitchen for a glass of water when I heard a frantic, whispered voice coming from the guest room. It was Rebecca on her phone. Her confident lacquer was gone. Her voice was thin and sharp, with a panic I'd never heard before. She was hissing into the phone, telling someone named Mark that he didn't understand that the deadline was the end of the month and they were out of time. Her voice cracked as she said no, she wouldn't sign, that she was being difficult. I heard her say she didn't know what else to do, that if this falls through, they lose everything. The house, the cars, everything. I stood there in the hallway, frozen, the words echoing in the grand, quiet house. This wasn't about helping me grieve. It was about a deadline. It was about losing everything. And in that moment of chilling clarity, I understood. I wasn't a mother-in-law to be cared for. I was an obstacle to be removed. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. The next morning, the air in the house was so thick with unspoken things, you could have cut it with a knife. Rebecca was unnaturally cheerful, flitting around the kitchen making coffee, while David was completely silent, a thundercloud in a human suit. They were a perfect portrait of strained family harmony, but after what I'd overheard, I could see every crack in the canvas. I knew I had to do something, but a direct attack was foolish. So I waited, feeling a kind of predator's patience I never knew I had in me. My moment came at breakfast. David was just listlessly stirring his coffee, staring into the mug like it held the secrets of the universe. I decided to ignore Rebecca completely and turned to my son, putting on my best benign grandmotherly expression. I told him, my voice soft, that I was just thinking about his old college fund. I reminded him how proud his father was of how well he'd managed it, and that he always had such a good head for investments. It was such a simple, innocent-sounding thing to say, but it landed like a well-aimed stone. David flinched so hard his spoon clattered against his mug. Across the table, Rebecca's head snapped up, her eyes wide with pure alarm. My son just stammered, his face going pale, saying he didn't know. Rebecca jumped in immediately, forcing a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. She said there was no need to bore me with all that financial talk, that David's portfolio was far too complex now, and that he'd moved way beyond simple college funds. David, bless his heart, seized the lifeline she'd thrown him and mumbled that yes, it was very diversified. I just gave a faint smile. I felt like a teacher watching my students completely fail a pop quiz. The panic was so real, it was practically a third person at the table. Their stories were already diverging, she claimed complexity. He pleaded ignorance. Their lie was a clumsy patchwork thing, and my simple little probe had just torn the first hole in it. They were amateurs. Later that afternoon, I got my chance. Rebecca was in the garden, pacing back and forth on a long, tense phone call. I knew she was monitoring my calls, so I went to the old iPad Frank had bought me years ago, the one Rebecca always dismissed as a senior's toy. I drafted a brief, urgent email to a name she would never recognize: Eleanor Vance. Eleanor had been my closest friend in the history department, a brilliant woman with a mind like a steel trap and a deep-seated hatred for bullies. The subject line was simple, just 2 words: Roman history. It was a code we'd used for years to signal a real crisis. The message itself was short. I told her I needed a Centurion, that my house was under siege, and to call me on that device at 4 o'clock sharp. At precisely 4 p.m., the iPad chimed with a video call. Eleanor's face appeared, her expression crisp and clear as she asked what was happening. I didn't waste a second. I quietly explained everything: the will, the power of attorney papers, the panicked phone call I'd overheard, and their disastrous reaction at breakfast. I heard her take a sharp breath on the other end. She said it was a financial siege, just like I'd said, and that I needed my lawyer Alan immediately. I told her I couldn't call him, that Rebecca was screening everything. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She said I wouldn't have to. With that familiar fire in her voice, she told me she would call him, that she would be my messenger, and all I had to do was tell her what to say. As I relayed the details, I felt the first real flicker of hope I'd had in weeks. I had an ally. I had a plan. But just as I ended the call and quickly wiped the email and call log from the device, I looked up and my heart stopped. Rebecca was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, a cold, suspicious glare on her face. She asked me who I was talking to. I kept my voice smooth and told her it was just an old friend from the book club. Her eyes narrowed. The control was tightening. That brief victory of finding a lifeline to the outside world was immediately swallowed by the chilling realization that my gilded cage was shrinking. This was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. After Rebecca caught me on the iPad, the air in the house grew so heavy it felt hard to breathe. Her kindness became sharp and brittle like a thin layer of ice over a deep, cold lake. Every cup of tea she brought me felt like an interrogation. I knew I had to change tactics. As a history teacher, I know that when you're outnumbered and isolated, a direct confrontation is a fool's game. Sometimes the most powerful move you can make is a strategic retreat. So the next morning, I began to feign compliance. I complained of a terrible headache and told them I was feeling completely overwhelmed. I let Rebecca bring me tea and toast in bed, and I played the part of a grieving, confused widow to perfection. When she mentioned the complexities of the estate again, I just sighed and told her she was right, that it was all too much for me, and my head was just spinning. I saw it then, a flicker of pure triumph in her eyes. My daughter-in-law, completely blinded by her own arrogance and desperation, saw exactly what she wanted to see, a frail old woman finally breaking under the pressure. The atmosphere in the house eased almost immediately. David looked visibly relieved, and Rebecca's oppressive attentiveness softened into a kind of smug confidence. They thought they had won. And while they were celebrating their quiet victory, what I didn't know at the time was that their entire world was collapsing. They were sitting in some sterile office building across town, opposite a man in a suit, who told them the final investment call had failed. The biotech startup, a company called Centurion, was bankrupt. Everything was gone. You see, 2 years earlier, they had been seduced by a dream. A charismatic friend of David's had pitched them a guaranteed unicorn that would revolutionize cancer treatment. They wanted to escape the Wellesley rat race, to finally feel secure in a town where wealth is everything. So they emptied their savings, and then they took out a second mortgage on a house they couldn't really afford. They poured every last cent into that company, even lying to Frank about it being a safe real estate venture. Now it was all just ash. The loan payments were due, the foreclosure notices were coming, and the inheritance wasn't just a windfall to them, it was the only thing standing between them and absolute public ruin. Of course, I knew none of those details yet. All I knew was that I had to prepare. While Rebecca was downstairs making triumphant calls to her friends, probably hinting at a resolution to the family estate, I was far from resting. I used my iPad to access my private banking portal. With a few quiet taps, I transferred a significant sum of money from a joint account Frank had set up into a brand new private account under my name only. Then I went to Frank's closet. At the very back behind his old winter coats was a small, locked box I'd forgotten about. I found the key in his desk drawer. Inside was a collection of old documents, including the original deed to the house. And under that, a sealed envelope addressed to me in Frank's familiar script. The label on it read, "For Margaret, to be opened only if they challenge me." My heart ached, but I felt a surge of strength. Even now, he was still protecting me. Later that day, Rebecca, growing careless in her perceived victory, made a critical mistake. She left her leather portfolio open on the desk in the guest room while she went to take a shower. I slipped into the room, my heart pounding. Tucked into a side pocket was a folder clearly labeled Synthogenics. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was everything: promissory notes, default notices from the firm, and a letter from their bank outlining the shocking terms of their second mortgage. The numbers were staggering. It all clicked into place. This wasn't just about greed anymore. This was about survival. And I was now holding all the proof I needed. I had the name, I had the motive, and I could practically smell the scent of their fear on the papers in my hand. I had spent the last 2 days playing the part of a frail, compliant widow, and Rebecca, bless her arrogant heart, had swallowed it whole. She had been orchestrating my life with the smug air of a commanding officer confident that her victory was complete. That all ended at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. The doorbell rang a sharp, authoritative chime that cut right through the quiet, tense atmosphere she had so carefully cultivated. She went to answer it herself, probably expecting a flower delivery she'd ordered for me, another prop for her stage. From the doorway of my study, I watched. On the doorstep stood my oldest friend, Eleanor Vance, her expression as grim and determined as a Roman general's. Beside her was a man in a severe dark suit, holding a leather briefcase. He was exactly as I remembered him, Alan Pritchard Frank's lawyer and mine. Rebecca didn't know him by sight. The man spoke his voice, leaving absolutely no room for argument, and introduced himself as my attorney. He and Eleanor, he stated, were here to see Mrs. Margaret Lane. Rebecca's face went completely white. You could see the panic flash in her eyes as she tried to physically block the doorway, stammering something about how I wasn't seeing anyone, that I was resting. Alan didn't even blink. He simply informed her that they had an appointment and stepped right past her into the grand foyer, as if he owned it, which, in a legal sense, I suppose he did. Eleanor followed, giving Rebecca a look of such profound disdain it could have curdled milk. That was my cue. I emerged from the study. I had deliberately dressed not in a robe, but in a smart tweed blazer. I stood up straight, met their eyes, and thanked Alan and Eleanor for coming. The whole facade of control that Rebecca had built so carefully over the past few weeks shattered in that single instant. My son David came stumbling out of the living room, his face a mess of confusion and fear, asking his wife what was going on. Alan Pritchard didn't waste a moment. He opened his briefcase on the hall table and produced a document. He explained in a cold, flat voice that it was a cease and desist letter. It demanded that they immediately stop interfering with my mail, my telephone, and my personal and financial affairs. Then came the hammer blow. He told them it also served as a formal notice of eviction. He stated that since they were in my home under false pretenses and causing me significant emotional distress, they had 24 hours to vacate the premises. Rebecca just stared at the paper, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. And then the dam broke. The sophisticated Wellesley matron vanished, replaced by a cornered animal. She shrieked, her voice cracking, that I couldn't do this. She screamed that they needed that money, that I didn't understand what was happening to them. Her face twisted with rage, and pure terror whipped around to my son. She ordered him to tell me what would happen if I did this. Confronted with the irrefutable proof of my strength and the sight of his wife completely unraveling, David just crumbled. He choked out the whole story, sinking into a nearby chair as if his legs could no longer hold him. He told me about the investment, the biotech firm, how it had gone bankrupt, and they had lost everything. He confessed that the bank was going to take their house. Rebecca began to sob then, but it wasn't a sound of grief. It was the raw, ragged, ugly sound of utter desperation. She whispered, staring at me as if I were a stranger, that Frank's will was supposed to have saved them, that it was their only way out. She wailed that they were going to be ruined, that everyone would know. The full, pathetic story just tumbled out of them. The lies, the bad investment, the secret second mortgage, the impending social and financial collapse. Their hidden history was no longer hidden. It lay exposed in the center of my beautiful foyer, shameful and pathetic. The confession just hung in the air, creating a vortex of shock and blame. I saw David look at his wife with a dawning horror, as if seeing for the first time that he hadn't married a partner, but the architect of their destruction. I watched it all, my heart aching for the son I loved, but my resolve was hardening like steel. I had not been the predator in this house. I had been the prey, and the hunt was over. I stepped forward, and my voice, though quiet, cut right through the sobbing. I told them to get their things. My tone was absolute. The power had shifted. I was no longer the victim, no longer just a grieving widow. I was Margaret Lane, the mistress of my own home, and I was dictating the terms. I gave them until noon the next day, telling them the locks would be changed then. They just stared at me, powerless, terrified, and utterly defeated. Their private reign of terror was officially over. You know they left that Friday just before noon without another word. The weekend was quiet, and the locksmith came and went. The house was mine again, but the silence felt heavy, full of questions. The final confrontation, the real resolution, was set for the following Monday. We met in the sterile wood-paneled conference room of Alan Pritchard's law office in downtown Boston. It was neutral ground, a place where emotion would be countered by cold, hard legal fact. I had insisted that David be there, but not Rebecca. Her ambition was the engine of this disaster, but my son's weakness was the fuel. My battle was with him, with the man who had stood by and allowed all of this to happen. My friend Eleanor sat beside me, a silent, formidable pillar of support. David sat opposite us, looking haggard and utterly broken. Alan informed me that Rebecca had refused to come, a final, futile act of defiance that surprised no one. I began, and I kept my voice steady and clear. I didn't need to raise it. I just laid out the timeline of events since Frank's death, a calm, methodical recitation of every power play, every manipulative kindness, every lie. I detailed Rebecca's escalating aggression and looking directly at my son, his passive, silent complicity in it all. When I finished, Alan slid a thick file across the polished table. He told David that this was a summary of the financial activity on his and Rebecca's accounts for the past 2 years. He explained it had been obtained via subpoena, an action made necessary by his wife's attempt to secure power of attorney under fraudulent pretenses. Alan opened the file. Inside were bank statements, default notices from the biotech firm, and a copy of the official foreclosure warning on their Wellesley home. Every single page was another nail in the coffin of their lies. Then it was my turn again. My voice softened because this part was for me and for Frank. I told David that there was one more thing. I placed the sealed envelope Frank had left me on the table between us. I told him that it seemed his father knew them both better than I ever did. I broke the seal. Inside was a letter written in Frank's strong, clear hand. I handed it to Alan, my own hands trembling just slightly. He read it aloud. It began with, "My dearest Margaret." The letter explained that if I was reading this, it meant David and Rebecca had challenged his last wishes, and for that, he was so sorry. He wrote that for years he had watched them, seen their hunger for a life they hadn't earned. He wrote about Rebecca's ambition and David's weakness in the face of it. And then came the part that made my son let out a choked sob. Frank had written that he'd loaned them money 6 months ago for what they called a real estate venture, but his own inquiries had revealed it was for a highly speculative company called Synthogenics. He knew. He wrote that he feared they had lost it all. The letter continued. Frank explained that his will was not an act of punishment, but an act of protection. For me. He had placed all our assets into a revocable trust with me as the sole trustee. I alone had the power to control it. What I did with it, he wrote, was my choice. And then Alan read the final lines. Frank's last word on the matter was this: his legacy was my security. He begged me not to let them take that from me. That letter was the final, undeniable piece of evidence. It dismantled every lie, every justification they could ever have. The judgment in that room came not from me, but from the ghost of the man we had all loved and they had so profoundly betrayed. David just sat there exposed and ashamed, crushed under the weight of his father's prescient words. I looked at my son, and my heart was a tangle of sorrow and pure, hard resolve. I then delivered the final consequences not with cruelty, but with the cool precision of a surgeon. I stated that the trust stands as his father intended, and I would not contest his wishes. The home was mine. The assets were mine to manage. I let that sink in. Then I told him that however I would not see my only son homeless, I would pay off the second mortgage on their house. But it would be a loan with a formal legal repayment plan. They would have to sell the house a place they could never afford anyway and downsize to something they could manage on their own salaries. This, I told him, was the only help he would receive. There would be no more handouts. I stood up, then my movement signaling the end of the meeting. The justice was proportionate. I had reclaimed what was mine, nullified the threat, and set a firm, unbreakable boundary. I hadn't destroyed them, but I had forced them finally to face the consequences of their own choices. David just sat there alone at the table, a man who had lost his inheritance, his wife's respect, and his father's trust, all in a desperate, greedy grasp for a life he was never meant to have. You know, after a storm passes, the silence that follows can be louder than the thunder ever was. The aftermath of that meeting was a landscape of quiet, inevitable ruin for them. In a town like Wellesley, news travels faster than bad weather. The story of the Lanes' financial collapse rippled through the community, a cautionary tale whispered over lattes and at country club dinners. Soon enough, a for sale sign was hammered into their manicured lawn, a public monument to their failure. Rebecca, who had lived and breathed for her social standing, became a ghost. Her invitations dried up. Her calls went unanswered. The status she had been willing to kill for had vanished overnight. From what I gathered, the paths they took in the wake of their downfall were starkly different. Rebecca, it seems, remained bitter, locked in a tight, shrinking cycle of blame. It was the fault of the biotech firm, the fault of the market, the fault of her gullible husband, and most of all the fault of the cold-hearted old woman who could have saved them but chose not to. She saw the loan I gave them not as the lifeline it was, but as an insult, another tool for me to control them. I heard she and David barely spoke, the chasm between them filled with a toxic combination of her resentment and his shame. David, however, began a slow, painful journey toward accountability. Stripped of the pressure to perform and the illusion of wealth that had been suffocating him for years, he seemed to find a piece of his former self. He took a less glamorous but more stable job in the city, and he started visiting me on Sunday afternoons. He never asked for anything. He would just sit with me in the quiet living room and we would talk. The conversations were stilted at first, full of things unsaid. But over time, a fragile new relationship began to form, one built not on expectation or obligation, but on the hard-earned, uncomfortable truth. Meanwhile, I thrived. That siege had awakened a part of me that had been dormant for years, maybe even since Frank had passed. I was no longer just his widow. I was Margaret Lane, a woman of formidable strength and intellect. I reconnected with Eleanor and my old friends from the history department, and we restarted our book club. With Alan's help, I used a portion of the estate to establish a scholarship fund at the high school, where I had taught a way to honor Frank's unwavering belief in education. The house, which for a few weeks had felt like a gilded cage, was now filled with the warmth of genuine friendship and a new sense of purpose. I was living with a peace and a freedom I hadn't realized I had been missing for so long. 6 months passed like that. One crisp autumn afternoon, I was in my garden, trimming the last of the roses before the frost came. David's car pulled into the driveway. He got out holding a small potted chrysanthemum, its yellow petals bright against the graying sky. He walked over and handed it to me. He looked me in the eye, and his voice was quiet but clear when he said he just wanted to say thank you for everything. I took the flowers, my eyes meeting his. I knew there was a long road ahead for him, and that our relationship would never be what it once was. The trust that had been broken could never be perfectly mended. But in that moment, I saw not the weak man who had betrayed me, but the son who was finally painfully learning to stand on his own. I had protected my husband's legacy just as he had asked. But in doing so, I had also created my own. I was secure, I was respected, and I was free. The new permanent dynamic was set, a reality built not on a will or an inheritance, but on the wisdom I had earned and the strength I had reclaimed for myself. In the end, Margaret's story teaches us that true justice isn't just about punishment. It's about restoring the balance and security a loved one intended. Her real strength wasn't in anger, but in her calm, calculated response. She understood the deep fear and desperation that drove her son and his wife, but she never allowed that understanding to excuse their betrayal. By delivering consequences that were firm but fair, she didn't just win a battle over an estate. She honored her husband's legacy and in doing so reclaimed her own peaceful and independent future.